The afternoon sun was bright, but it did not feel warm inside the big hospital waiting area. It was a huge room with glass walls on one side, letting everyone see the busy street outside. But inside, the air was cool and smelled like strong medicine and old coffee. The man sat on a soft, blue sofa near the middle of the room. He was dressed in an expensive suit that looked very clean and sharp. He kept looking at the gold watch on his wrist, tapping his foot on the floor. He was a very busy person, used to getting what he wanted quickly, and today things were moving too slow for him. He was waiting for news about his father, and every minute that passed made him feel more annoyed. He hated waiting. He felt like his time was the most important thing in the world. Across the large room, in a quiet corner near a tall, fake plant with green leaves, sat a small piano. It was an upright piano, painted a dark brown color, and it looked a little old. Next to the piano sat an elderly woman. She looked very small in the big chair. Her hair was the color of snow, pulled back neatly. She was wearing a simple cardigan and a long skirt. She had been sitting there for a long time. The man noticed her because she was not moving. She was not reading a book. She was not looking at her phone. She was just sitting there, with her hands resting quietly on her lap, looking at the closed part of the piano where the keys hide. To the busy man, this did not make any sense. He could not understand why someone would just sit and do nothing. The hospital was a place for action, for doctors running, for nurses calling names, for people worrying and moving. But this woman was like a rock in a river. She was perfectly still. The more he looked at her, the more irritated he became. He thought she was taking up space for no reason. He thought she was being lazy. He started to tap his foot louder, trying to make some noise that might catch her attention, but she did not move. She just kept looking at the piano with eyes that looked very far away. He stood up from the blue sofa. He walked to the window and looked out, then walked back to his seat. He picked up a magazine, flipped 2 pages, and threw it back down. He checked his phone, scrolled through some emails, and sighed a very heavy, loud sigh. He wanted everyone to know that he was impatient. He wanted to say, "Hurry up," to the whole world. But mostly he was angry at the silence. The silence in the room felt heavy to him, and he blamed the woman in the corner. He felt that if she was not there, the room would feel different, better. He did not know her story. He did not know that she had a name or a history. To him, she was just an obstacle in his day, something that was blocking his comfort. The man decided he had enough. He could not sit there and be polite anymore. He felt that he had the right to say something because he was stressed and because he was important. He stood up and straightened his tie. He looked around the room to see if anyone was watching him. A few people were reading, and a nurse was writing on a clipboard at a desk. He walked across the polished floor, his shoes making a hard, clicking sound. He walked right up to the corner where the old woman sat. The sound of his steps seemed very loud in the quiet room. When he got close to her, he stopped. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at her. He expected her to look up at him, maybe look scared or surprised. But she did not move. She kept her eyes on the closed piano keys. It made him feel even more ignored. He felt a heat rise in his chest, a mix of anger and a strange need to prove that he was in charge of the space. He thought that if he spoke loudly enough, he would break the spell she seemed to be under. "You know," he said, his voice sharp and cutting through the quiet air, "it is really annoying to watch someone just sit there." The woman slowly turned her head. Her movement was slow and careful. She looked up at him. Her face was full of lines like a map of a long life. Her eyes were pale blue and looked very tired. She did not speak. She just looked at him, waiting for him to finish. The man took a breath and continued, feeling a bit of power because she was listening. "This is a public place," he said, pointing a finger at the piano. "That instrument is there for people to use. If you are not going to play it, you should let someone else sit there. People are waiting. You are just taking up space." He paused, looking for a reaction. She blinked slowly. Her expression did not change. She did not look angry, which surprised him. She just looked sad. It was a deep kind of sadness that he did not understand. He felt like he was shouting at a wall, but he kept going because he had already started. "Look," he added, rolling his eyes a little, "either play something or go sit somewhere else. Some of us are trying to have a productive day. We don't need to watch you stare at a piece of furniture. It is weird and it is distracting. Just move along." The words hung in the air. The man felt a sudden rush of satisfaction, thinking he had fixed the problem. He thought she would stand up and leave. He thought he had won. But the woman did not stand up. She looked back at the piano. She looked at the closed keys as if they held a secret. She took a deep, shaky breath. The man watched her, waiting for her to leave. He crossed his arms tighter, ready to watch her go. He did not know that in the next few seconds, his feeling of victory would turn into something he would never forget. He just stood there, tapping his foot, completely unaware that he was about to witness a moment that would change how he saw the world forever. The silence that followed his words was heavy, like a thick blanket that had been thrown over the room. The man stood there with his arms still crossed, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He believed he had spoken the truth that everyone else was thinking but was too polite to say. He looked down at the elderly woman, expecting her to look ashamed, to grab her bag, and to hurry away. He was used to people moving out of his way when he raised his voice. In his world, money and speed were the things that mattered, and he had both. But the woman did not move. She did not pack her bag. She did not even look frightened. She just looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue, and they held a look that was not angry but incredibly tired. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from living a very long life, a life that had seen too many difficult days. She blinked slowly, her long, gray eyelashes fluttering like moth wings. Then she turned her head away from him and looked back at the piano. It was as if he had disappeared. It was as if his voice had been just another noise in a world full of noise, like a car horn or a slamming drawer. This made the man feel a hot flash of anger. He hated being ignored. He cleared his throat loudly, ready to say something even meaner to force her to look at him again. But before he could speak, the woman moved. It was not a fast movement. It was slow and difficult, like a rusty machine trying to work after years of sitting in the cold. She shifted her weight on the bench. The old wood creaked under her. Then slowly she lifted her right hand. The man watched, his mouth slightly open, ready to mock her again. But when he saw her hand up close, his nasty comments got stuck in his throat. Her hand was not like his. Her skin was thin and paper-like, spotted with age. Her knuckles were swollen and large, twisted by arthritis. It looked painful just to hold her arm up. Her fingers were curled slightly, as if they had forgotten how to straighten out. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer effort it took to lift her own arm. The man's sneer faded a little. He felt a small twist of discomfort in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He told himself she was just being dramatic. She is just trying to make me feel bad, he thought to himself. She is doing this on purpose. He stayed rooted to the spot, his feet feeling heavy on the polished floor. He wanted to leave, to walk back to his seat and check his phone, but something kept him there. It was a strange curiosity. He wanted to see what she would do. Would she try to hit him? Would she finally cry? She did neither. With a slow, trembling motion, she reached out and placed her swollen fingers on the white and black keys. She did not press them down yet. She just rested her hands there, as if she was greeting an old friend she had not seen in 50 years. Her left hand joined the right. It looked even stiffer than the right one. For a moment, nothing happened. The man rolled his eyes. Great, he thought. Now she's going to play one note and call it music. He let out a loud sigh through his nose, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The tension in the room was tight, like a rope being pulled from both ends. Then her fingers moved. It was not a clumsy bang. It was not the tune of a child's song. The first sound that came out of the piano was a deep, rich chord that seemed to vibrate right through the floor and into the man's shoes. It was a sound so full of sadness that it made the hair on his arms stand up. The man blinked. He stopped tapping his foot. He stared at her hands. Those twisted, painful fingers were moving across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. She was playing a melody that was complicated and beautiful. It was not fast. It was slow and heavy, like rain falling on a roof, but without the rain. The music filled the waiting area. It floated over the empty seats and the fake plants. It went through the glass walls and seemed to silence the traffic outside. The man's brain could not understand what he was hearing. He had expected noise. He had expected a mistake. But this was perfect. It was not perfect in a technical way. Sometimes her fingers slipped, and a note buzzed because she didn't hit it hard enough. But the feeling behind the music was perfect. It sounded like a heart breaking. It sounded like a memory of a love that was lost a long time ago. He looked at her face. Her eyes were closed now. A small smile played on her lips, but it was a sad smile. She was not in the hospital anymore. She was somewhere else in a memory only she could see. The pain in her hands seemed to vanish as she played. The shaking stopped. For those few seconds, she was not an old, frail woman. She was strong. She was powerful. The music was her voice saying everything she could not speak out loud. The man took a step back. He felt very small. He looked around the room. A nurse who had been walking by with a tray of cups had stopped walking. She was standing perfectly still, watching the woman. A young mother holding a sleeping child looked up from her magazine, her eyes wide. The entire atmosphere of the room had changed in a heartbeat. It was no longer a place of annoyance and waiting. It was a place of magic. The man felt a lump form in his throat. He did not know why. He told himself it was just a song. He told himself he didn't care about this kind of stuff. But his heart was beating faster, and not from impatience this time. He watched her fingers dance over the ivory keys. They looked like birds trying to fly in a storm. Every note was a struggle, but every note was beautiful. He realized that he had been wrong. He had been terribly, completely wrong. This woman was not wasting space. She was filling the empty space with something real. She was giving a gift to everyone in the room, even to a rude man in a suit who had told her to go away. The music swelled, getting a little louder. The sound was so clear and pure that it made the cheap hospital walls seem to disappear. The man felt a strange pressure behind his eyes. He swallowed hard. He suddenly felt very ashamed of his expensive suit and his gold watch. He felt ashamed of his hurry. In the face of this kind of beauty, his busy life felt very unimportant. He wanted to apologize, but the music was too loud. He couldn't speak. He could only stand there and listen, feeling the weight of his own words crushing him. He had mocked a silent woman, thinking she had nothing to say. Now her silence was screaming at him, and he had no choice but to listen. He stood there frozen as the melody wrapped around him, changing him second by second. The music continued to flow from the old, upright piano, filling the wide open space of the hospital waiting area. It was not just a sound. It was a living thing that seemed to breathe and move. The melody was complicated, weaving high, soft notes with deep, heavy bass tones. It sounded like a story of love and loss, a story that had no words but that everyone in the room could understand. The man stood frozen near the piano, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. His brain was trying to catch up with what his ears were hearing. Just a few minutes ago, he had seen this woman as a nuisance, someone who was wasting his precious time. Now he was seeing her differently. He was seeing a master at work. The people in the waiting room had completely stopped what they were doing. A young man who had been typing furiously on his laptop put his computer down on the table and turned his chair toward the music. A little girl who had been crying loudly a moment before went quiet and rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the woman's moving hands. Even the receptionist behind the high desk had stopped shuffling papers. The air in the room, which usually felt cold and sterile, now felt warm and heavy with emotion. The man felt a strange tightness in his chest. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry. He could not understand why a simple song was affecting him this way. He told himself he was just tired, but deep down he knew it was something more. It was the beauty of it. It was the raw, naked honesty of the sound. While the woman played, a nurse in blue scrubs walked quietly across the floor. She was carrying a clipboard, but she wasn't looking at it. She was walking toward the man. She moved slowly so as not to disturb the music. She stopped right next to him and stood still for a moment, listening. The man glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. He expected her to tell him to move or to ask him to be quiet. Instead, she kept her eyes on the piano player. She had a look of pure wonder on her face, as if she was watching a star being born. "Do you hear that?" the nurse whispered. Her voice was so soft that the man had to lean in to hear her. He nodded slowly, not trusting his own voice to speak. "That is Mrs. Gable," the nurse said, keeping her voice low like a secret. "I have worked here for 15 years, and I have never heard her play a single note, not one." The man looked at the nurse, confused. "But she plays beautifully," he whispered back. "She looks like she has been playing her whole life." "She has," the nurse replied, turning to look him in the eye. Her expression was serious, filled with a mix of sadness and respect. She used to be a very famous pianist. She played in big concert halls all over the country. People would pay a lot of money just to watch her perform. The nurse paused as a particularly difficult run of notes floated through the air, amazed at the precision. But that was a long time ago. 5 years ago, she had a very bad stroke. The man felt his stomach drop. He looked back at the woman's hands. He saw the swelling and the shaking again, but now he saw it differently. It wasn't just old age, it was damage. The stroke was terrible, the nurse continued softly. It affected the right side of her body. It took away her ability to speak. It paralyzed her arm and leg. The doctors told her she would never walk again, and they were certain she would never play the piano. Her hands were clenched tight into fists for years. She had to relearn how to hold a spoon, how to brush her hair. Playing piano was supposed to be impossible. The man felt a sudden chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the room. He remembered how he had yelled at her. He remembered his cruel words about her sitting there like a statue. He thought about the immense effort it must have taken just to lift her arm, the pain she must be pushing through to make her fingers obey. He felt a wave of nausea. He had mocked a warrior without knowing she was fighting a war. "She comes here every day," the nurse added, her voice cracking slightly. "She takes the bus by herself. She sits in the ICU waiting room upstairs. Her husband is up there. He is very sick. He was the one who taught her to play when they were young. He can't really talk anymore, but she sits with him for hours. She hasn't touched a piano in 5 years, until today." The revelation hit the man like a physical blow. He looked at the woman with new eyes. She wasn't playing for an audience. She wasn't playing to show off. She was playing a message to her husband wherever he was. She was trying to reach him one last time, crossing the bridge of silence that illness had built between them. And he, the man in the suit, had tried to stop her. He had tried to silence the only voice she had left. The music began to slow down. The notes became softer, more gentle, like a heartbeat slowing down at the end of a long life. The woman's head was bowed, her silver hair shining under the electric lights. She looked exhausted. Every note was a victory, but the cost of that victory was written in the tension of her shoulders. "She is doing this for him," the nurse whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And maybe, in a way, she is doing it for you too." The man looked at the nurse, his face pale. "For me, you told her to play," the nurse said simply. "Maybe she needed someone to push her, even if you weren't very nice about it. Or maybe she just wanted to prove that she still could." The man turned back to the piano. The shame he felt was overwhelming. It burned in his throat and behind his eyes. He saw his own impatience reflected in the sterile hospital walls, and it looked ugly. He saw his selfishness. He had been worried about a few minutes of lost time, while this woman was fighting against the failure of her own body to say goodbye to the person she loved most. The music swelled one last time, a bright, piercing high note that seemed to hang in the air forever, ringing like a bell. Then the woman's hands slid off the keys and fell back into her lap. The room was silent again, but this time the silence was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the memory of the sound. The man stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to run away. He wanted to hide, but he couldn't move. He knew he had to stay and face what he had done. He realized that he had just witnessed a miracle, and he had almost been the one to crush it. The weight of his own arrogance settled on him, heavier than any suitcase he had ever carried. He watched her take a shaky breath, and he realized that his life would never be the same after this moment. He had learned a lesson that no business school could ever teach him, a lesson about kindness, about hidden battles, and about the terrible danger of judging a book by its cover. The last note of the melody seemed to hang in the air for a long time, floating like a feather in the wind before it finally disappeared. The music stopped, and the waiting room fell into a deep silence, but this silence was very different from the one before. Before, the silence had been empty and annoying, a gap that needed to be filled with noise or action. Now, the silence was heavy and full. It felt like the air was holding its breath, afraid to break the spell that the woman had created. The sound of the piano still seemed to echo in the corners of the room, bouncing off the glass walls and the floor. The woman's hands, which had moved with such grace and strength just seconds ago, suddenly lost their energy. They slid off the keys and fell heavily into her lap. It looked like they had suddenly become made of lead. Her shoulders slumped forward and her head dropped low. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with a shaky rhythm. You could see the tremble running through her arms again, the pain returning now that her focus was gone. The effort of playing that song had taken everything out of her. She sat there looking very small and fragile once more, like a bird that had flown too high and was now resting its tired wings. The man stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. His heart was beating so hard that he could feel it thumping against his ribs. The regret he felt was not just a small thought in the back of his mind. It was a physical pain in his stomach. He felt sick. He looked at his own hands, smooth, manicured, and capable, and then he looked at her swollen, twisted fingers. He realized the immense mountain she had just climbed. He thought about the cruel words he had shouted at her. He had told her she was wasting space. He had told her to move along. Those words now felt like heavy stones in his mouth. He wished he could reach into the air and grab them, stuff them back into his pocket, and swallow them before they could ever be heard. But it was too late. The words were out there, floating in the room, mixing with the ghosts of her beautiful music. He looked around the room. Other people were waking up from the trance, too. The nurse was quietly wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. The young mother was holding her child tighter, looking at the old woman with a look of deep respect. No one was clapping. No one was cheering. It didn't feel like that kind of performance. To clap would have been too loud, too rude. It felt like the end of a prayer, something sacred that required quiet respect. The man felt out of place. He felt like an intruder who had walked into a holy place by mistake and tracked mud all over the floor. He desperately wanted to say something. He wanted to fix this. He opened his mouth, his lips trembling slightly. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry. He wanted to tell her that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He wanted to explain that he was stressed and worried about his father, and that he hadn't meant to be so mean. But his throat felt tight, as if a giant hand was squeezing it. No sound would come out. He realized that "I'm sorry" was such a small, weak pair of words for what he had done. How could two little words fix the fact that he had tried to silence someone who had lost her voice? How could he apologize for mocking a miracle? The woman slowly lifted her head. She turned her face toward the man. Her eyes were watery, rimmed with red, but they were clear. She looked right at him. For a second, the man flinched. He expected her to look angry. He expected her to glare at him, to let him know that she heard his insults and that she hated him for them. He braced himself for her judgment, but her face did not hold any anger. There was no hatred in her eyes. Instead, there was a look of gentle pity. It was as if she looked right through his expensive suit and his important job and saw the scared, lonely man underneath who didn't know how to be kind. She gave him a small, tired smile. It was just a tiny lifting of the corners of her mouth, but it hit him harder than any shout could have. It was a smile of forgiveness. She was forgiving him for being a fool. She didn't care about his ego or his impatience. She had played her song, she had said her piece, and she was at peace. That smile broke him. It made him feel even smaller, not in a bad way, but in a way that humbled him. He realized that she was stronger than he was. She had faced a stroke, lost her ability to speak, and lost her husband's presence, yet she could still smile at a stranger who had been cruel to her. He had everything: money, health, success, and yet he was the one who had been miserable and rude. The man looked down at the floor, unable to hold her gaze. He felt a hot stinging in his eyes, and he realized he was fighting back tears. He, a grown man who hadn't cried in years, felt like crying right there in the middle of the hospital. He was overwhelmed by the sheer goodness of her spirit compared to the darkness of his own. He felt a deep, aching shame that settled into his bones. He knew he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Every time he felt impatient, every time he wanted to judge someone, he would see this woman's face and hear her music. The woman shifted on the bench, the wood creaking again. She slowly reached down to grab the handle of her bag that was sitting on the floor. Her movements were slow and careful. She was getting ready to leave. She turned her gaze away from the man and looked toward the elevators at the far end of the hall. The nurse had told him her husband was up there. He realized she wasn't playing for the room. She wasn't playing for applause. She had poured her heart out to reach him, to send her love through the floors and walls to where he lay sick. She was going back to him now. The man took a step back, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum. It sounded very loud to him. He wanted to go help her, to offer her his arm to carry her bag. But he stopped himself. He felt he didn't have the right to touch her. He had already intruded on her space enough. He stood there, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, watching her gather her things. He realized that he had just witnessed a moment of pure, unselfish love, and he had tried to trample on it. The weight of that realization was crushing. He stood in the shadows of the waiting room, a changed man, but a man carrying a very heavy burden of regret. He watched her, praying silently that she could hear the apology screaming inside his heart. Even though he couldn't make his voice speak it out loud, the woman slowly pushed herself up from the piano bench. It was a difficult, slow process. She had to use her arms to lift her body, and her legs shook visibly under the weight of her small frame. She let out a soft, tired groan, a sound of effort that was quiet but clear in the now silent room. The man watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of pity and admiration. He wanted to run over and offer her his arm. He wanted to be the person who helped her stand, who carried her bag, who opened the way for her. But his feet felt like they were stuck in heavy cement. He felt that he had lost the right to touch her, to be near her, after the terrible things he had said. He stood frozen in the shadows, feeling like a ghost in his own life, just watching her go. She reached down and picked up a small, worn purse that had been sitting on the floor beside her. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp for a moment, a small sign of the frustration she lived with every day, but she did not give up. She opened it, checked inside, and closed it again with a soft snap. Then she turned away from the piano. She did not look at the man again. She did not look at the nurse or the other people who were staring at her with wet eyes. She looked straight ahead toward the glass elevators at the end of the long hall. She took her first step. It was a shuffling step, her cane tapping hard against the floor to keep her balance. The man took a half step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracking, but the word was too quiet. It died in the air before it could reach her. He stopped himself. He realized that anything he said now would just be more noise. He had already used his voice to hurt her. He did not trust himself to use it to help her. He lowered his hand and let it hang by his side. He just watched. He watched every step she took, counting them as if they were precious gold. He saw the strength in her back, the determination in her posture. She was not walking away in defeat. She was walking away with her head held high, like a queen leaving a ball. It took her a long time to reach the elevators. The distance was only maybe 50 yards, but for her, it might as well have been a mile. The man did not look away, not even for a second. He ignored his phone when it buzzed in his pocket. He ignored the nurse who walked past him. His entire world had shrunk down to this one old woman making her slow journey across the floor. He thought about the music she had played. He realized that every note had been a step. Every beautiful sound was a victory over the pain in her hands. She had fought against her own body to create that beauty, and he had tried to stop her because he was impatient. She finally reached the elevators. She pressed the button. It glowed with a yellow light. She stood there waiting, looking at her reflection in the polished metal doors. The man wondered what she was thinking. Was she thinking about her husband upstairs? Was she hoping that he had heard her? Or was she just tired? The elevator made a soft ding sound and the doors slid open smoothly. A group of doctors walked out, talking loudly about medical terms and schedules. They moved fast, rushing past her with their coffees and clipboards, not even seeing the old woman standing there. She had to press herself against the wall to let them pass. The man felt a flash of anger at the doctors. How could they not see her? How could they not see the giant heart in that small body? But then he remembered that 20 minutes ago he was just like them. He was rushing. He was blind. The doctors cleared the doorway and the woman stepped into the empty elevator. She turned around slowly to face the waiting room one last time. For a brief moment, her eyes scanned the room. They passed over the fake plants, the blue sofas, and the reception desk. Then for a split second, her gaze seemed to land right where the man was standing. He held his breath. Did she see him? Did she know he was still there, watching her with a heart full of regret? He couldn't tell. Her expression was peaceful, blank, and calm. Then she reached out and pressed the button for the upper floor. The doors began to slide shut. As the gap between the doors narrowed, the man felt a sudden panic. He felt like he was losing a chance to say something important. "I'm sorry," he shouted in his mind, screaming the words so loudly that his head hurt. "I am so sorry." But the doors closed with a soft thud. The elevator rose, carrying her away. She was gone. The room felt very empty now. It felt like the sun had gone behind a cloud, even though the bright afternoon light was still streaming through the windows. The silence returned, but it was not the peaceful silence of the music. It was just silence. The man stood there for a long time, looking at the closed elevator doors. He felt a deep exhaustion settle over him. It wasn't physical tiredness, it was a tiredness of the spirit. He felt like he had run a marathon and lost. Slowly, he turned around and walked back to his seat on the blue sofa. He sat down heavily. He put his head in his hands. He looked at his expensive watch. It was only 15 minutes later than when he had first stood up to yell at her. 15 minutes. In his whole life, 15 minutes was nothing. It was the time it took to drink a coffee or send a few emails. But in these 15 minutes, his entire view of the world had shifted. He felt like a different person was sitting in the suit. He thought about his father, the reason he was in the hospital. He had been annoyed that the discharge papers were taking so long. He had been thinking about his work, about a meeting he had to get to, about money he needed to make. He realized now that he was treating his father the same way he had treated the woman. He was treating his father as an inconvenience, as a task on a to-do list. He wasn't seeing his father as a person who had lived a long life, who had stories to tell, who had loved and lost just like Mrs. Gable. The man felt a new tear roll down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly with the back of his hand, but another one followed. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. He saw the emails, the missed calls, the stress of his job. He looked at the screen for a moment, and then he did something he never did. He turned the phone off. He pushed the power button, watched the screen go black, and put it deep into his pocket. He didn't need it right now. The world could wait. His deals could wait. The emails could wait. He leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. He tried to hear the music again in his mind. He tried to remember the sound of the notes, the way they had floated in the air. He realized that the music wasn't just a song. It was a lesson. It was a lesson about patience, about kindness, and about the hidden battles everyone fights. He promised himself that he would never judge anyone again just by looking at them. He promised that he would slow down. When a nurse finally came out and called his father's name, the man stood up. He didn't jump up anxiously like he would have done an hour ago. He stood up slowly and calmly. He walked over to the nurse with a soft smile. "How is he?" he asked gently. He didn't demand anything. He didn't check his watch. He just listened. As he walked through the sliding glass doors to the back rooms, he carried the sound of the piano with him. He still felt the sting of regret for his cruelty, but he also felt a spark of hope. He knew that because of that silent woman, he was going to be a better son today, and maybe, just maybe, a better man for the rest of his life.